I'm your host, Christine Niles, and this is the show where we explore the riches of our Catholic faith and how it informs our daily lives. As usual, let's go ahead and start out asking for Our Lady's intercession. I'd like to do so in the official language of the Church, which is Latin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Tonight, I'm delighted to have with me Professor Ronald Rychlak. He's Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Mississippi. He advises the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations on issues of international law. He also serves as a delegate at the meetings of the Assembly of States Parties to the International Criminal Court before he became a professor of law at the University of Mississippi, practiced law in Chicago, and also clerked for Judge Harry Welford on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, among many other accomplishments. And tonight we're going to be talking about a lot of his research with regard to Pope Pius XII and Hitler and the disinformation campaign that has been kind of going in full force for quite a number of years now. He's going to do his part to dispel some of the calumny and myths that have been floating around about Pope Pius XII. So welcome to the show, Mr. Rychlak. It's wonderful to have you here. I was noticing you had clerked on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Yeah, that's right. Harry Welford, he actually kept his chambers in Memphis, and that's where I met my wife. So my whole life changed
wonderful.
Because of Judge Welford.
Now, you know, after law school, I clerked on the Indiana Supreme Court, but I did spend a summer clerking for a circuit court out in New Mexico. But before that, I did interview for a fellow judge on the Sixth Circuit. Are you familiar with Judge Boggs?
I know
Boggs?
the name. I don't.
Okay.
I do know the name, that's all.
He's sort of notorious for giving these arcane quizzes, intellectual knowledge quizzes to every interviewee. And it was the strangest interview I'd ever been to in my life because he asked all sorts of questions about baseball and history and philosophy and theology. And by the time I left there, I felt like the dumbest person in the world because I could only answer half his questions. But I thought he's another judge on the Sixth Circuit.
Baseball has saved me more than once.
Oh, really?
I can usually talk baseball with people.
see, I'm the opposite. I grew up on tennis. I didn't watch any baseball. So anyway, but you're going to be talking a little bit about Pope Pius XII tonight, and I really appreciate your work trying to clear away some of the disinformation. I read your book, Hitler, the War and the Pope, a number of years ago. It was an excellent book, and I recommend it to everybody. And I know that you have since revised it based on recent information that you've discovered. But, you know, for listeners out there who are wondering, well, why is this topic important? Why is it timely? Why is it relevant? I'd like to play just a brief clip of an address given by someone named Jeffrey Roberts. He's a human rights lawyer, and he delivered this just last November at the Royal Institution of Great Britain. And Mr. Rychlak, of course, he was there because he debated this man, so he's familiar with some of the content. But I just want to give listeners an idea of the sort of calumny that continues to be spread about our Holy Father to this day.
His silence gave license to Catholic members of the SS to shoot the Jewish men, women, and children as they cowered on the edge of the mass graves, to turn on the gas in the concentration camp chambers, and then to go to confession with an untroubled conscience. It encouraged the Germans in the belief that God was still on their side. We shall see. It gave so many Catholics the excuse not to help Jewish refugees, although many did. The Pope's silence in face of this overwhelming evil was a deliberate choice. It was an immoral and counterproductive choice. As for the 6 million Jews of Europe, he never lifted a bejeweled finger or stretched a vocal cord to save them. Why did he lack the moral principle to say loud and clear that the extermination of the Jewish race is wrong? He didn't act because he didn't want Catholics to suffer the same fate. Really, can you imagine Himmler, a communicant Catholic, gassing his own congregation?
To answer his last question, yes, I can certainly imagine him gassing fellow Catholics.
Yeah.
I mean, I went to Dachau concentration camp, and there was a bunker that was set aside specifically for Catholic priests. They were treated horribly, and yes, some of them are gassed. So where do you even begin with all this misinformation?
One of the points, when you get right there, 2,500 Catholic priests died at Dachau. Not Catholics, 2,500 priests. The Pope, in his reaction to the death of the priests, was precisely the same as it was into the death of Jewish peasants. He did what he could through intervention, through reliance on local bishops and clergy and people there. There were times when you put. I'm delving deeper into my argument here. I'm sorry, but I think you revved me up. You brought back the emotional debate of that night when you played that clip for me.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and this claim that he didn't lift a bejeweled finger to help the Jews, that's demonstrably false.
It's so outrageously false. We go through document after document, go through testimony after testimony. The villains despised Pius XII. The victims thanked him profusely, and the rescuers cited him as their inspiration and their authorization. And he was the one who urged, ordered, in fact, in Rome that the convents be open, the rectories be open, to so many people who were in hiding from the Nazis, Jews and others. He went on a wartime's ration himself. He was over 6 feet tall, weighed 118 pounds at the end of the war.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
It is. And there would be bombing raids in Rome, and afterwards he would immediately go out with blankets, with money, with blessings, with food, comfort the people. He lived and died that war. And here's the thing, Christine. During the war era, everyone knew that. I go around and I do talks all over the United States and occasionally elsewhere, like that debate in London, and I do a PowerPoint slideshow, and I put up headlines of newspapers from the war, editorials. The New York Times saying Pius XII is the only one who's speaking against Hitlerism. He's the only one out of the silence of a continent. Pius XII was pointing his finger at Hitler, and everyone knew it. And there was no doubt, there was no question. Within Germany, there may have been question because the Nazis completely controlled the media. There was, you couldn't get messages into, without risking a lot. And the messages went in sometimes, but you risked a lot of lives when you did that. And one of my, I think, most telling stories is when Pius XII smuggled a message into occupied Poland, and it was a profound statement about what was going to happen and the future of Poland and how the world would stand up and Nazism would be defeated and the Poles needed to remain hopeful. The bishop, who was still in Poland, wrote a very nice letter back to the Pope, thanking him profusely, so the people of Poland will learn of this and will remember it forever. But right now I'm burning your letter. I'm not going to read it because it will cause people to die.
Right. So that explains, sometimes why he seemed silent on this.
Yeah.
Because of the retaliation. Right.
Very outspoken. The bishops in the United States were very outspoken because there was no retaliation. In other places it was very dangerous. So there wasn't there wasn't one size fits all.
Right, exactly. You know what? I actually want to read some quotes from earlier magazines and journals about Pope Pius XII. For instance, Time magazine, 1943, says, "It is scarcely deniable that the Church Apostolic, through the encyclicals and other papal pronouncements, has been fighting against totalitarianism more knowingly, devoutly, and authoritatively, and for a longer time than any other organized power." Okay. New York Times, October 28th, 1939. It hailed Pope Pius XII's first encyclical, Summi Pontificatus, and it said, presenting a picture of contemporary life as devastating as any of the Old Testament prophets could have drawn, the pontiff proclaimed his determination to step forward boldly, the name of my radio show, Forward Boldly. It is Germany that stands condemned above any country or any movement in this encyclical, the Germany of Hitler and National Socialism. So people understood back then where he stood, where Pope Pius XII stood on this.
Absolutely. The campaign to discredit Pius began and fizzled right after the war and then picked up again in the 1960s. During the war, there was no question. And even after the war, the campaigns against him fizzled. because people had seen what he had done, how he had acted, how people around him had behaved, and the thanks and the credit that Golda Meir and other representatives of Jewish people, but representatives of every background praised him and thanked him.
Right. There was just one more quote from a paper that is called The Jewish Veteran that I just wanted to read. Quick quote here from March 1939. It has an editorial entitled, "Hail Pope Pius XII." They were all rejoicing that Eugenio Pacelli was elected pontiff. And it says here, Pope Pius XII is known as a staunch friend of Jews and on several occasions expressed his strong opposition to the persecution of Jews in Germany and Italy. Known as a vigorous champion of the Vatican's anti-Nazi policy, the anti-Semitic fascists tried hard to prevent Cardinal Pacelli's election. Their failure demonstrates the lack of influence of anti-Semites in the princes of the Catholic Church. So clearly everybody understood at that time, unlike today, exactly where Pope Pius XII stood. But could you go back to his pre-pontificate years and talk about some of his actions back then, say back in the 1920s?
Sure.
He's appointed papal representative in Munich.
Right. He was sent to Bavaria in 1917 to try to broker a peace, and then to help dislocated persons, prisoners of war, folks like that. When peace finally came about, of course, then he's in Germany. He is in the world. It's a big city, but in the world scheme, the future dictator of Germany, Adolf Hitler, and the future Pope Pius XII, are both in Munich, and it's
they're both in the same city.
The time when the war veterans feel that the rug was pulled out from under them. They don't understand why Germany capitulated. The Treaty of Versailles imposes very harsh terms, terrible unemployment. These soldiers have nothing to do. There are no jobs, and so there's fighting in the streets, and there's rampant inflation. And there was a brief communist takeover. And while he was there, the future pope was held at gunpoint at one time. Another time, his nunciature, the place where he lived and worked, was sprayed with machine gun fire. Those were really during the communist era. During the time as the Nazis were coming into being, because they kind of went through different stages where there were different groups and different leaders, the future pope was there, and he watched this develop, and we have records of 40 speeches he gave, and 44 speeches, and in 40 of them he condemned racism, Nazism, things like that. In 1921, he's quoted in the newspaper saying, the communists are gone, but there's a new element that's just as dangerous, and he was referring to the Nazis. In 1923, he wrote back to Rome, expressly named Hitler, said that these followers of Hitler are very dangerous. They're abusing Jews and they're abusing Catholics. He cited a Catholic bishop who was setting a good example by standing up for the Jews. He saw this happen, and then he left Germany in 1929 before Hitler came to power, but he became Cardinal Secretary of State. So he's the Secretary of State in the 1930s, as Hitler really took over Germany in 1933. So he's the guy doing a lot of the international negotiations and stuff at the time in the 1930s. So this interesting intersection continues even before the war.
It's amazing when you look back on that, the ways of divine providence. God knew exactly what he was doing. He was preparing the future pontiff, for this role that he was going to play during one of the worst wars in the world, dealing specifically with Hitler. And I know that he had a special love for Germany, too. I mean, it said that when he spent a number of years there, and then said when he had to go to Italy, he sort of left his heart in Germany.
Well, I think that sometimes is overstated. And I think critics will sometimes try to say that and say, he wasn't harsh enough on Germany. He actually, we remember him a lot of times. People who remember him at all remember his last years, and he'd been very sick and he was kind of withdrawn. In the 1920s and 30s, he's a diplomat. He was considered a witty conversationalist, a person you wanted to have at your society parties. And there's a quote from him in the 1930s when the concept of Germans was brought up, and he said, I've been around Germans long enough to truly appreciate the company of the French. It was sort of saying.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment. I'm actually part French, so I will take that as a compliment.
Well, it was a compliment to the French.
That's funny.
I think his critics overstate his affection for Germany. He could speak German, of course. He was a representative there. He made friends wherever he went. So of course, leaving is hard. But he didn't want to leave Rome to go to Germany in the first place, and coming back to Rome was, of course, coming home for him. So I don't think he was as reluctant as it's sometimes depicted.
Now he became Pope in 1939, and that's the same year, of course.
Right. Yeah, about 6 months before the outbreak of World War II. Leading up to World War II, as he's Cardinal Secretary of State for Pope Pius XI, the Pope who preceded him, there were some very interesting things there. When Hitler came to Rome to visit in 1937, the Pope and Secretary of State Pacelli, the future Pius XII, left Rome, closed all of the museums. If you watch the History Channel or some of those shows, you know that Hitler loved to film himself under the Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower, all the places he would go, they'd make films. There are no films of him in the Sistine Chapel or anywhere in the Vatican because the Vatican went dark. The parade route that was scheduled to impress Hitler had to be rerouted to avoid the Vatican, because it was going to be a big embarrassment. The fact that he was being slighted. The Pope left behind also a message that priests and nuns were not to take part in these festivities. So,
right, and they had left early for the summer residence, right? They left Vatican.
Right. They left several months early, a couple months early, and Pius XI said the air in Rome makes me ill. So it was an insult to Hitler.
Right. Now let's turn for a moment to the encyclical written by Pope Pius XII, but which Pacelli actually helped to draft, Benedor Sorga. Right. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right, yeah, and that was another amazing statement from the Church. Encyclicals, of course, are usually the Pope will draft in his native language, and they're converted to Latin and released in Rome. This one was written in German, at least released in German, and it was released inside of Germany. It was smuggled into Germany, distributed to parishes across the country, read on Palm Sunday. I heard Masses were about 2 hours that day. When I'm speaking to priests, I always joke about that at least they don't have those super long Masses. Yeah. But it was a strong condemnation. When this was reprinted in the United States in the Catholic Digest, it was, the title was translated as "To the German People." Really, probably, with burning anxiety is what I think probably an appropriate translation. But here, Pope Pius XI condemned this idea that people can lock within their concept of a single nation all the great things that God has given to people. He said this idea of extreme nationalism and racism cannot be tolerated. You cannot be a Christian. He famously, shortly before he passed away, Pius XI said, anti-Semitism is incompatible with Christianity. We are all Semites. You can't be an anti-Semite. And this encyclical expressed that same basic idea. One of the really neat things now, since more archives have been opened, is we've seen drafts. We've seen the various drafts that were put together. And we know the future Pope Pius XII had a very significant hand in drafting that encyclical. You actually see handwritten notes where they've crossed things out, put new things in, trying to hit a very strong tone. Remember, you're still trying to avoid war if you can, but also make a very strong statement. The Nazis, of course, got caught off guard, so this got read en masse, but then printing presses were smashed. People who were involved in the delivery got arrested. It was suppressed. It was not reprinted officially. There were some underground copies that circulated, but no official republication of it again until after the war. The Nazis absolutely would not tolerate things like that, being said or written. Right.
So very clear condemnation of Nazism, which Eugenio Pacelli, future Pope Pius XII, had a hand in drafting. It was interesting to read that they actually used a force of motorcyclists to smuggle this into Germany and have it read from every single Catholic pulpit in the nation. That's pretty amazing. And immediitely right afterwards, was it like the day after, the Nazis came and seized all the copies?
And in some areas it was later the same day. It was as soon as they heard about it, essentially.
Wow. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Concordat, because I know the Church gets criticized for this. The Concordat with Germany, Hitler.
Right. Absolutely false criticism there. Pius XII, when he was the representative in Germany, his job, he was instructed by Pius XI to try to negotiate treaties, concordats, with the various German states. At that time, the nation of Germany was not quite as united, so you would negotiate actually with the individual states. Bavaria was where Pius XII was located at first, moved to Berlin. And he negotiated 2 or 3 such concordats. He tried to negotiate one with the Soviet Union. Pius XI did not like Catholic political parties, and that's pretty much, that's essentially been the view from the 1920s on, that we don't have Catholic political parties anymore. We try to protect the rights of Catholics, prevent them from being abused with agreements, concordats between the Vatican and the nation in question. So Pacelli was trying to get an agreement with the Weimar Republic throughout the 1920s, and there were proposals from the Vatican that were on the table, and Weimar would not agree with them. And the Weimar, of course, was the democratic government that preceded the Hitler era in the 1920s in Germany. When Hitler comes to power, Hitler is looking for ways to establish his international credibility, his new regime. He first signs the Four Powers Pact: Germany, Italy, England, and France. He renews a trade agreement with the Soviet Union, a friendship agreement with Great Britain, and then he turns to the Vatican and he picks up the proposal the Vatican had put forward and said, "We take it." And very interesting inside the Vatican now, looking at some of those files that have been released, where the Pope and the Secretary of State, the future Pope Pius XII, well understood that there would be political advantage for Hitler to sign an agreement with the Vatican. At the same time, they also understood that if they didn't do this, there were very serious threats of what was going to happen to Catholics inside of Germany. The future Pope Pius XII, in confidential discussions with other diplomats, said, "There's a pistol pointed at our head. We either sign this and we give some credibility to Hitler, or we don't sign it and our people start getting killed, and we don't know what's going to happen next." And they were under no illusions. They understood even if they sign this agreement, the Nazis are going to do bad stuff. But they thought maybe at least we'll have a legalistic approach. By the way, that ended up later on being very important, saving a lot of Jews. But that's kind of a separate point. But here in 1933, as Secretary of State, Pacelli signs the Concordat on behalf of the Holy See, and this, I think, foolishly, the critics try to say, "See, it's Pacelli, it's the future Pope Pius XII who signed this, who negotiated this, who did this." He did it because he was acting under the authority of Pope Pius XI. The Pope who's in charge is the one who calls the final shots. A lot of the critics like Pius XI and kind of try to draw a distinction between the 11th and the 12th. The 11th, however, said, "Pius XII speaks with my voice." He absolutely identified Pius and cultivated Pius and Pacelli to become his successor.
Wonderful. You know what? We have a caller who's been waiting on the line. I want to go ahead and get to this person. Okay, caller, area code 914. You are on the air. What's your name and where are you from?
I'm Alice von Hildebrand.
Oh, wonderful. It's Dr. Alice von Hildebrand. It's wonderful to hear from you, Dr. von Hildebrand. I understand that your husband was very close friends with Pope Pius XII.
Yes, there was a great friendship between my husband and Pius XII. And let me tell you briefly what I would like to share with you. My husband met Pius XII in Munich in 1917. He was a young convert at the time, has been in the church for about 3 years, and was extremely anxious to make the acquaintance of great people in the church. From the first moment, he was incredibly impressed by the spirituality of Pius XII, by his brilliant intelligence, and by his total devotion to the church. They became friends. He stayed in Munich for 5 years. He was often the guest at my husband's house. He had inherited the house from his father, the famous sculptor. They had dinner together. He assisted when one of his brothers made a bust of Pius XII, and he discussed with him his book on marriage. Being a convert, he was extremely anxious that every word that he said would be in total agreement with the teaching of the church, and expand his ideas on the relationship between love and fruitfulness. And they walked back and forth along the Isar in Munich, and he gave my husband his full assent for this idea that love has a logical precedence over fruitfulness, but both are so linked that they cannot be severed. But much more important is a question of Nazism and communism. When Hitler came to power, my husband immediately left Germany because he didn't want to live in a country dominated by a criminal, and moved to Vienna, where he founded a magazine that was both anti-Nazi and anti-communist, because his basic idea was that there's no essential difference between the two. In both cases, same materialism, same atheism, same stateletry, same hatred of the human person, total disrespect for the dignity of man, and for this reason, they seem to be antagonistic when in fact their philosophy is the same. Now, my husband was extremely anxious to know the position of Pacelli on Nazism. And in January 1935, he went to Rome. And because he knew Pacelli so well, he had a long private audience that was devoted to discussing Nazism. And there's one thing that I would like to insist upon. It is written in my husband's unpublished memoirs that he wrote at my request. And Pacelli said to him, between Nazism and Christianity, there is an abyss that cannot be traversed. It is like fire and water. He indicated very clearly that he considered Nazism to be a total abomination and was opposed to it. Simultaneously, he was an incredibly intelligent and clear-sighted man. He was conscious of the fact that there was communist infiltration in the Vatican. Let me mention 2 examples that are going to exemplify it, and this is something which is not often mentioned and should be mentioned. Number 1, Pius XI was very anti-communist, but clearly against communism, and founded an organization of young Christian heroes, mostly Jesuits, that were trained to infiltrate into Russia and keep faith alive. They knew the language perfectly. They were so well trained, and all of them, one after the other, once they arrived at the border, was arrested, tortured, killed, or sent to a concentration camp, for the very plain reason that they were traitors in the Vatican who knew their names and immediately indicated they were entering. Worse than that, in 1965, my husband and I made the acquaintance of someone called Bella Dodd. She was Italian-born, came to the United States when she was 6, extremely bright and talented, and went to Hunter College, where I taught for 37 years, but that was, of course, long before my time. In Hunter College, she became an ardent communist because some of the professors were already spreading communism in the classroom. She got a BA, went to Columbia, got a PhD, was reappointed in Hunter to teach political philosophy. Because she was dynamic and charismatic, she converted many of her students to communists, was working for the Communist Party, and at one point was working up to 18 hours a day. She gave up her tenure and worked full-time for the Communist Party. Her special mission Let me repeat, a special mission was to recruit young men that had neither faith nor moral for the priesthood, to invade Catholic seminaries. Clearly, many of them, of the easiest to conquer, were homosexual, which explains the drama that has taken place in the church, and this is something which is never mentioned. Right. Bella Dodd said to my husband and myself, here in the place where I live, that unfortunately, when she was working full-time for the Communist Party, she was so devoted, and she was in contact with the Vatican. And she said, and I can repeat this word for word, 4 cardinals were working for us, and I was in close contact with them. Pius XII, when he became Pope, had prohibited any sort of contact between the Vatican and Stalin. One very fine day, a French detective brought him a pack of letters indicating that he had been disobeyed. Apparently, he turned pale in horror, and from this very moment became very distrustful. He was so clear-sighted and so far-sighted that he knew Nazism could not endure, because, apart from all the horrors that I've mentioned, the philosophy of racism is so stupid. To judge people according to the size of their nose or the color of their skin is a sign of stupidity. He knew full well that communism is infinitely more dangerous because it has universal appeal. It is based on the promise of creating justice in a world which is dreadfully unjust. Right. From this point of view, there are 2 things that I would like to mention. His rejection of Nazism and his awareness that communism was more dangerous because it was more enduring. Nazism lasted for 12 years. Stalin reigned from 22 to 63 and then continued, and it is not yet dead. For this reason, the communists knew that they considered communism to be more dangerous than Nazism. This is where they got someone called Hochhuth to write a piece that was a sheer pack of lies. It was simply nothing but resentment and hatred against Pius XII. This explains all the horrors that have been written about him. It's all based on lies. And it must be insisted, he was hated, and he paid the price by being so maligned.
2 wonderful, great men, Pope Pius XII and obviously Dietrich von Hildebrand. And von Hildebrand himself became a target of Hitler, and he was essentially had to escape the country, of course, and eventually end up in the USA. But I thank you so much, Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, for sharing your insights.
You're welcome to be sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Rychlak, about this play, The Deputy, because this is really when things started turning against Pope. Could you talk about this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the traditional answer when people say, well, why do so many people think Pius XII it was a bad guy? You'll say, well, it's this play that produced in Berlin in 1963, came to Broadway in 1964, and it's a play that depicts Pius XII as a bad guy, and the person the world knows as the author, Ralph Hochhuth, a German playwright, sort of still around, still alive, made a career out of writing political kind of plays, and that was the perceived answer, and that's the answer I used to give when I was asked about what happened, how did Pius XII's reputation change. It was never a satisfying answer to me because it didn't make sense to me that a fictionalized play honestly could flip the world's opinion the way that play seemed to. And that's really been the interesting thing in the last several years, and my most recent writing has been on looking at how actually Soviet bloc information and disinformation agencies got involved in promoting this play, translating the play, producing the play, writing reviews of the play, writing articles about the play, writing books about the play. It's just amazing. That story was broken by the former head of foreign intelligence for Romania, Ian Mihai Pacepa, in 2007. And I spent 2 years researching it. This because when I first heard it,
you were
it didn't
skeptical,
seem to
right?
Yeah. I did. Come on, really?
Right. Soviet pot.
But if I've already written the book where I've already got the Vatican and the Nazis, do I really need to bring the Kremlin in? That's kind of what I was thinking. And I went down to the public library, and within 20 minutes, I'd found some interesting stuff that suggested to me that it's possible. And then I spent 2 years working on this, and actually wrote in the second edition of Hitler, the War, and the Pope. It's chapter 16. Wrote about the Soviet bloc intelligence operation, was known as Seat 12, Seat being the Holy Seat and 12 being Pius XII, which involved attempting to discredit. They really didn't care about Pope Pius XII. He was dead before this play was produced, but they did want to discredit the Catholic Church, Christianity, the sense of religion itself, and Western values to a certain level. And if you can associate a Catholic Pope with the Nazis, you go a long way towards accomplishing all of those things. And that was their goal, to try to do that. And they certainly had this remarkable run with this play. And Hochhuth, his play was essentially handed over to a committee, and the play that came out of the committee was 8 hours long. To produce it would have taken 8 hours. They brought this well-known theatrical producer, Erwin Piscator, who throughout his life had been a communist, who said that the purpose of theater was to advance the communist cause. Openly wrote about that forever. They got right after the wall went up in Berlin, the communists opened a theater in West Berlin, in the free part of Berlin, precisely for the purpose of doing communist propaganda plays in the non-communist part of Berlin. They brought Piscator to that theater, and the first play he did was The Deputy. He took the 8-hour-long committee-written play, cut it down to 2 hours. It was not very successful, and yet it was immediately translated and produced all over the world. I talked to a young lady. In fact, when I was in London for that debate that you played from earlier, I met a young woman who had gone to high school in Hungary, and she said during the communist years, they were required to watch that play every year. It was produced every year for the kids. It was done. It was propaganda. It was all propaganda. And in America, that seems so far-fetched. Just think that can't be, but it really was.
Yeah, and you have a really good article that was posted in the National Catholic Register where you list kind of all the evidence and all the ties between communists and the production of this play.
It was amazing. As I'm doing these 2 years of research, I'd come home and I'd find, the producer who did this was a communist. The guy who wrote this book wasn't, and these people, I didn't list people as communists unless they said they were communists, unless they were very open about it. And these were people who were calling themselves communist in the 1950s and 60s, at a time when you didn't make a joke about that. That was not something you said lightly.
Sure.
Today people can call themselves a socialist or something. You didn't do that in the 1960s, and yet it's amazing the number of people. The producer on Broadway was sanctioned by the House Committee on Un-American Activities for covering up some of his activities with the Communist Party. The guy who wrote published the book about the play in the United States said, "You can bet I'm a communist, and that's my religion." It's just over and over you see this stuff, and it all then really makes sense. So it wasn't just a play that caused the world to change its opinion of Pius XII. It was an orchestrated campaign, the play just being part of it.
And in some ways, it's gained a measure of success, unfortunately. But we're doing our best to fight against that. Now let's turn for a moment to one of the criticisms, which is that Pope Pius XII remained too silent during World War II. Could you please address that for our listeners?
Oh, sure. Look, the Pope, as we talked about earlier, the world understood where he was. The press understood where he was. There was no question about that. But he was well aware that There are times and there are places where I can be much more outspoken, and there are times and places where being outspoken is going to backfire. A famous story out of Holland, where Edith Stein, this Jewish girl, grows up, becomes and studies philosophy, is drawn to the Catholic Church, ultimately becomes a nun. When the Nazis take over Germany, her order sends her to Holland. And so she's in Holland when the Nazis come there. And the Catholic bishops and Protestant leaders both went to the Nazis and said, we're not going to have happen here what's happened elsewhere. We're going to put out the major announcement against what you Nazis are doing. And the Nazis said, if you do that, you'll regret it. It will be much worse for the people if you do that. The Protestant leaders said, okay, we won't do it. The Catholic bishops went ahead with their strong statement. The Nazis then said, if that's the case, we are going to consider Jewish people of Jewish ancestry who are converted to Catholicism our worst enemy and ship them off as soon as possible. Edith Stein, her biological sister, and many other people who had been protected by their Catholic baptism, which really they were protected because of that Concorde we talked about earlier. Concorde said if you have a Catholic baptismal certificate, you're a Catholic and you're protected. The Concorde had protected them, but now it didn't, because the Nazis said if you're going to be that way, we're not going to honor our commitment and we're going to ship you off. If you had a Protestant baptismal certificate, you were not sent off, but if you had a Catholic one, you were. And so if you're the Pope now, you realize there are times when being forceful will make things worse. There are other times, Hungary is an example that's often cited, where forceful statements had some success. The Pope is relying upon his bishops in all these affected areas and doing what is the best thing, in that specific place. And I think that's all that a man can do in that situation.
Right. And what about the retaliation against the Dutch Catholics?
Oh yeah, well, I mean that's it. I mean, the Dutch Catholics. The Catholics themselves, but particularly the Jewish Dutch Catholics, who were all sent off, Edith Stein and others, to Auschwitz and killed immediately. Those are people who probably would not have been deported, certainly not at that time, but for the strong statement by the Catholic bishops.
Now, I wanted to ask you, too, I know that there's been some debate over whether or not he was involved in helping to issue false baptismal certificates to Jews.
Yeah, I mean, that really is a very interesting issue. My very good friend, Bill DeWino, looked into this. He did some writing about it, suggesting that perhaps they really, because, if false baptismal certificates were indeed issued, then, that's lying to protect the Jews. And there's a debate, is a lie ever appropriate? And I always say, that's a theological question, which is kind of above my pay grade. I try to do history and law. It seems to me that we know John the 23rd is credited in particular with doing a lot of false baptismal certificates. DeWino says that they may have been travel documents, not really baptismal certificates.
Okay.
But I'm not sure I agree with Bill about that, but Bill's a good scholar, and he and I are both sort of together have looked at this stuff, and
sure.
I think so it's a tough question, but it seems to me a couple popes did it, so it's probably okay.
I know it's a pretty heated debate that I myself have participated in the blogosphere, and I know it'll continue on for a long time. But we do know that he did help shelter Jews in the Vatican. Now, how many Jews is it estimated that he saved?
Well, it's really hard to separate him from the Catholic Church. So, if we look across all of occupied Europe, Pinchas Lapid, who was an Israeli diplomat who spent 6 months in the Yad Vashem archives, that's the archives in Tel Aviv on the Holocaust Authority, came up with an estimate of about 860,000. I actually believe that he did not have information relating to some areas that we've developed since, so we have estimates as high as 1.5 million. In Rome itself, people usually say about 8,000. which is about half of the Jewish population. There was a much higher rate of survival in Rome than there was in some of the other areas, maybe out of tribute to the Pope. There's a fascinating story that in the Hitler, the War, and the Pope. I have the testimony from Carlos Wolff, who was a German general who got the orders from Hitler, draw up plans to go into the Vatican, invade it, capture or kill the Pope. And right. Wolff was a decent man who was not really a committed Nazi, and he didn't want to do this, and he didn't know how do we get out of it, and he came up with basically convincing Hitler that if we do that, we will not be able to continue occupying Rome. At that time, the Nazis were occupying Rome, but Wolff convinced Hitler that if we do go into the Vatican, the Italians will never put up with it. Occupation will become much, much harder. And Hitler eventually said, okay, but as soon as the war is over, we're going in to get him.
Right, that's a little-known fact, this plot to kidnap the Pope by Hitler. Mm-hmm.
And actually, last time I was in Rome, I was allowed to look at the minutes of the meeting of the Curia, where they talked about this, where
and how they would get him out.
Yeah, looking at what they're going to do. And essentially, Pius XII said, if I'm kidnapped, I resign as Pope, so they will never hold the Pope kidnapped.
So clearly they took this very seriously.
They absolutely took it seriously. That's so evident that they clearly thought that was highly likely that would happen. And I was able, last time I was in Rome, too, to stand up. If you're familiar with St. Peter's and then the plaza there, I got to stand pretty close to the papal apartment, which is, if you're looking up at St. Peter's, it's up to the right. I got to stand in a room pretty close to there, and I'm standing there. And one of the priests who's there said, you always think of the Nazis standing out beyond the arms of that surround the courtyard. He said, really, they were right here behind us. He pointed down. They were less than a block away. They were half a block away, right down kind of behind the papal apartment.
Wow.
Which just it felt a lot
close.
Scarier. Yeah, when I thought of it that way.
Wow. Now I want to turn for a moment to some of the Jews during that time who praised Hitler. Can you talk about some of the prominent, public figures? Because I know he was named a righteous Gentile.
No, he was not.
Oh, he was not. I'm sorry. Okay.
He was not named. He's been nominated for that. There was discussion about that, but no, he was never named a righteous Gentile.
Okay.
There is actually, that's a. There's a current petition, and I have a book called Righteous Gentiles, and at the end of that book, I kind of make a plea supporting a plea that was, initiated by a rabbi here in the United States. Rabbi David Dallin said that we owe it to history to name Pius XII a righteous Gentile. But he was nominated. Golda Meir said, in our darkest hour, he was the one guy who stood up with us. The first president of Israel praised him. The head of the World Jewish Congress said Pius XII was the one person who stood with us. The chief rabbi of Rome praised Pius profusely after the war. He eventually converted and became a Catholic. He took Eugenio, the Pope's Christian name, as his Christian name. He said the conversion is not an issue of thanks or tribute. He had a vision of Jesus, and he said it's an honest conversion on that basis. However, he took the name Eugenio to thank Pius XII, and Pius XII was his godfather or sponsor.
That's where I got a little confused, because I think it was the chief rabbi who praised him as a righteous Gentile, but he wasn't officially named. Yeah,
that's right. Yes, he did.
Yeah.
So, at the end of the occupation of Rome, at the end of the war, and again at the time of the death of Pius XII, and I just go through like a page listing all of the Jewish groups and all the Jewish individuals and just everybody who sent thanks or words of praise or condolences to the Vatican or to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. Leonard Bernstein, the great conductor, stopped a concert and asked for a moment of silence at the passing of this great man. I mean, he was so well respected and recognized as someone who had really done so much to help the Jewish people that it's just preposterous the way people came to look at it, by the late 1960s.
Right. I wanted to read this quote from Albert Einstein. He's quoted in Time magazine, December 1940, and he said, "Being a lover of freedom, when the revolution came in Germany, I looked to the universities to defend it, knowing that they had always boasted of their devotion to the cause of truth. But no, the universities immediately were silenced. Then I looked to the great editors of the newspapers, whose flaming editorials in days gone by had proclaimed their love of freedom. But they, like the universities, were silenced in a few short weeks. Only the Catholic Church stood squarely across the path of Hitler's campaign for suppressing truth. I never had any special interest in the Church before, but now I feel a great affection and admiration, because the Church alone has had the courage and persistence to stand for intellectual truth and moral freedom. I'm forced thus to confess that what I once despised, I now praise unreservedly."
There's a very interesting thing about the Catholic priests inside of Germany when the Nazis came to power. The encyclical, the Concorde we talked about earlier, signed between Germany and it was not signed between the Hitler regime. It was signed between Germany and the Vatican. Essentially said Catholic priests and bishops could not be members of a political party. Many people say, "Well, see that you did away with the Catholic center party that had existed before." Well, the truth of the matter was Hitler did away with all political parties, so that shortly after this was signed, there was only one political party left, the Nazi Party. Nazis went around to many Protestant ministers, many of whom would not have wanted to join the Nazis, but were coerced into joining. And so a whole lot of Protestant ministers did join the Nazi Party. Very few Catholic priests did, and almost all of them invoked that clause from the Concordat and said, "I'm not permitted to be a member of a political party, so I shouldn't join." And the Nazis did not force them to join. So there was a book I read a few years ago about priests who were members of the party. Really, only about 2 in all of Germany that were actually that actually joined and stayed with the party through the war. There were some early in the process who had been involved, let's say in the 1920s, this was coming up. Many of them left the priesthood or they left the Nazi Party. They came to understand. So very few Catholic priests were actually members of the Nazi Party.
Right, so this claim by Jeffrey Roberts that all sorts of Catholic priests were helping the Nazis and all that sort of thing is just nonsense.
Yeah, it's preposterous. And you're in one of those debates, and this was a debate in a big room, and a historic room actually in London. And when someone is standing up and saying falsehood after falsehood after falsehood, it's really hard to sit there and because it's sort of where do I start?
Yeah, exactly. I was actually wondering, how did you sit through that? He went on for like 10 minutes.
It was not easy. And my co-debater there was Bill DeWino, whom we mentioned earlier, and so Bill and I, it was trying to figure out. I will say, we picked up a lot of support. We started with the room strongly against us, and we ended with the room, still against us, but not nearly as strongly. So we felt, percentage-wise, we had moved the room in our favor. So that was good.
That's wonderful. We only have a few minutes left, and I did want to get quickly to your new book out called Disinformation. It sounds absolutely fascinating. R. James Woolsey, former director of U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, said, "This remarkable book will change the way you look at intelligence, foreign affairs, the press, and much else besides." And I was reading about this. Anyway, could you talk to us a little bit about Disinformation?
Sure. Pacheco was the guy who in 2007 said, the whole Pius XII thing, that was a communist plot. Well, he and I, after I wrote the chapter for Hitler, the War, and the Pope, second edition, we got together, and he just taught me so much about how the worst thing that the communists did, you think of spies stealing information. They said, no, really the worst thing often is implanting false ideas and shifting a culture, moving a nation by getting them to believe falsehoods. Either thinking that Che Guevara was a great man or thinking that Pope Pius XII was a bad man. And his job when he worked in Romania was to try to change attitudes like that. And so we go through the book. The continuing theme is Pope Pius XII, and we talk about how The Soviets did that after World War II with certain cardinals in newly occupied areas who suddenly the Soviets are officially atheistic. Communism is atheistic because it can't survive if Judeo-Christian values survive. So you have to get rid of Christianity, Christian values, for communism to thrive. So there were mock trials, arrests of religious leaders in these newly controlled areas, Poland, Hungary, all those kind of places. And then it was the same basic thing with Pius XII in the 1960s. We're going to say this dead Pope was in fact a Nazi sympathizer. They knew he wasn't. It wasn't something they honestly believed, but they thought if we can convince enough people, we'll do it with a fictionalized play. So when people point out something's wrong, you say, yeah, it's wrong, but it's a theatric license. So you set it up that way. You make the world doubt the Pope, and if they doubt the Pope, ultimately they're doubting the very concept of religion itself.
Right. Could you tell our listeners where they can find out more about you or your books online?
Sure. Now, I do have a web page. It's badly out of date because I don't know how to do that stuff, but it's Pius, www.pius, Pius-XII, so Pius the 12th, but with a dash in the middle of it. Our new book, Disinformation, you can, of course, Amazon or in any of those places, but also WND.com, the publisher is WND, and so they have several things about it on there, and I would encourage everybody to learn about this, and I hope they'll take a look at the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to thank you, Mr. Rychlak, for all the work you've done in restoring the good name of our Holy Father. I'm sure that Pope Pius XII from heaven is grateful for your work as well. I understand that they're considering his beatification, canonization, and possibly even fast-tracking it.
Yes, I have heard that. They're up to everything but the miracle now. I mean, it's everything's approved except the miracles. So that's what they're waiting for.
Well, that's wonderful news. So anyway, I just want to thank you for helping to clear away some of these misconceptions. So I do appreciate your work so much. So thank you for being here tonight. Now, for all my listeners out there, thank you. For all my listeners out there, I'm going to be back Saturday, September 7th at 10 p.m. And I'm going to welcome as my guest Monsignor Richard Sozeman, who's going to call all the way from Rome. He's going to talk a little bit about his new book out, Reflections from Rome. And afterwards, I'm going to be joined by Kim Catola, who is going to be talking about healing after abortion. So that's in 2 weeks, Saturday, 10 p.m. Eastern Time. So until then, my friends, keep fighting the good fight. And in the words of St. Joan of Arc, in God's name, forward boldly. Okay, good night, everybody. God bless you.